There you go. Well, good evening, everyone. Before I call the meeting to order, I will remind members of council that our procedure bylaw forbids the use of cell phones and other electronic devices during meetings. And I will call the meeting to order at 6 p.m. by acknowledging that we are meeting on lands governed by the Williams Treaties, 1923. We recognize that our collective responsibility be good stewards of these lands and waters in perpetuity. I have a motion moved by Acting Deputy Mayor Rowley, seconded by Councillor Fredis, that the October 11th, 2023 Committee of the Whole meeting agenda be approved as presented. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion is carried. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest? And if so, please state the general nature thereof. There are none noted. We have one delegation for, one presentation for training purposes. Councillor training, procedural bylaw, and it comes from, Michelle, I'm going to ruin your name. It's Michelle Casavecchia-Somers and Michelle Smibert.
Very close, Your Worship. Casavecchia-Somers and Smibert.
Smibert, okay. Likely there's a motion at the end of this that will require me to remember all of that. So thank you. Thank you both. And I will simply turn the floor over to you for your presentation.
Well, thank you. Good evening, Your Worship and members of council and staff. I'm just going to, if I'm allowed to share my screen, we have a presentation for you. Bear with me one moment. Are you able to see that presentation?
We are.
Okay, wonderful. One moment here. Let me just get myself set up here. Thank you. And this is good evening, Your Worship, members of council and staff. It's a pleasure for Clerks on Call to be able to join you this evening. Tonight, we'll be undertaking a detailed review of your council procedure bylaw and offer some insights on how to use your bylaw to make the most of your meetings. So we've prepared a short agenda for our discussions, and we'll start with some brief introductions, then talk a bit about what a procedure bylaw is and why it's important. We'll highlight some of the legislative framework and discuss how the procedure bylaw contributes to the principles of transparency and accountability. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time with you tonight actually reviewing the various articles that are in your council procedure bylaw, the Brighton bylaw. And we'll conclude our presentation with some best practices to consider when reviewing your council procedure bylaw. So a little bit about us. We are Clerks on Call. We provide training in several areas of municipal governance and administration. We use our previous experience as municipal professionals to educate councils and staff to help develop and achieve their goals. We really believe that responsive, customized, need-based training makes a difference between a good municipal team and a great one. And we offer training in several areas, including, of course, procedure bylaw training. Some of the other ones are listed on the screen. And, excuse me, sorry. My apologies, I went too quickly. So I am Michelle Casavecchia-Somers, one of your trainers for tonight. 2.5 years ago, I retired after more than 34 years as a municipal CAO and clerk. And since retiring, I've shifted my focus and I'm now working as a municipal management consultant and trainer. And this has really allowed me to be able to continue to use my years of municipal experience to help other councils and staff find success. I'm a certified municipal officer and an accredited Ontario municipal clerk. And I'm joined this evening by my colleague, Michelle Smibert, and I'll ask her to take a moment to introduce herself to you.
Thanks, Michelle. Good evening, Mayor and members of council. My name is Michelle Smibert. I am the Deputy Mayor of Thames Centre. I have over 30 years of experience in local government on the administrative side, such as CAO, clerk, and Director of Corporate Services in both larger municipalities and smaller municipalities. I do want to commend you for taking the time to learn about your procedural bylaw. I honestly think that a lot of councils leave it to the clerk and or the staff to provide guidance on your procedural bylaw. But I think it's important that you know your bylaw so that you can navigate any situation that arises during a council meeting. Because I do understand that you need to be quick on your feet when you have delegations and you need to act quickly. And so the more or the better you know your bylaw and you understand it, I think the better results that you can see as a council as a whole.
Thanks, Michelle. So we do have a lot of material to cover this evening, but before we continue, I just want to let you know that we would welcome and encourage you to ask us questions at any point, with your permission, of course, your worship. We have scheduled some time at the end of the presentation for questions, but we do sometimes find that it's easier to deal with them as they come to mind during the presentation itself. So please don't hesitate to jump in, even if it means interrupting us to be able to ask your question or get your point across. We also hope to engage you at different points in the presentation, asking you for your thoughts along the way as well. Now, with that said, let's spend a couple of minutes talking about what a procedure bylaw actually is. So procedure bylaws direct the way that council and committee meetings run. They tell your council what rules exist to govern the calling, the place, and the proceedings of your meetings. And having an effective procedure bylaw can lead definitely to more productive meetings and ultimately help council to reach its goals. So generally, procedure bylaws describe how meetings are to be conducted. They define and ensure open meetings, and they indicate how notice is to be given to the public and how the public will be engaged in the meeting process. And while some elements of your procedure bylaw are legislatively required, your bylaw really should reflect what Brighton Council wants to see as far as your rules of procedure. Procedure bylaws are considered by many as a transparency and accountability tool, and when used effectively, really helps to provide for efficient local government meetings. And undertaking regular reviews, like you're doing this evening, of the bylaw ensures that it continues to meet any legislative requirements, as well as facilitating effective decision-making. So George Rusty is one of Canada's leading municipal lawyers, and he notes that the purpose of procedures is to seek to achieve consensus in an orderly and principled manner. So really, council's rules of procedure should be based on that principle. So what are some of the benefits of having good procedures? Active participation of everyone on council is necessary in order to make good decisions. And how you manage and run your council meetings is one of the biggest risk factors for participation and contribution by members. Having a robust procedure may help councils set a positive tone for their meetings, allowing for better and more active participation. You should be able to expect transparent, accessible, and legislatively sound proceedings at council and committee meetings. A good procedure bylaw will lay the groundwork for that to happen, and having good procedures can lead to better managed and more productive meetings. It's important that council makes the most of their time together, as this is when their authority is actually exercised. And the quality of formal council meetings can make a considerable difference. Clear procedure bylaws allow councils to encourage that collaborative approach that fosters respectful conduct and open debate. So what can happen if the rules of your procedure are weak? When your bylaw is not clear or up to date, then your municipality can actually face legal challenges. For this reason, it's critical that council decisions be made in accordance with the correct meeting procedures. If the correct procedures are not followed, it could provide the opportunity for the decision of council to actually be challenged. So I have a question for you. Can you think of an example of a situation where council's decision could be challenged if proper procedures weren't followed? And I would encourage members of council, if you can think of a situation, if with your indulgence, your worship, is just to interject into the conversation. Anybody have any idea when you could get in trouble if your procedures weren't followed?
I have one that comes to mind.
Yes, please.
Sure. I'm Councillor Jeff Wielden, and The first one that came to mind is if we did not go through the correct procedures regarding public notice around planning decisions, and then made planning decisions that had no public consultation, we could be appealed.
That's an excellent situation, and you're absolutely correct. Anyone have another example? One other one that I can think of is with respect to closed meetings. So if there happened to be a closed meeting investigation and it was determined that the proper closed meeting protocols weren't followed, then it could leave council's decision open to being challenged. So those are a couple of ideas. So as it's very important that we make sure that our procedures are good, they're solid, and they allow for us to be able to move forward efficiently and effectively. So now that we know what a procedure bylaw is and why it's important, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about some of the legislation governing procedure bylaws. So as you will know, municipalities, as creatures of the province, are entirely reliant on the provincial legislation. And the Municipal Act 2001 is undoubtedly the most important piece of legislation governing Ontario municipalities. The Municipal Act stipulates that every council must establish a number of different policies and processes. This slide lists some of the most significant ones, including the requirement to have a procedure bylaw. And throughout the presentation, you will also hear us refer to the notice policy, transparency and accountability policy, as well as council's code of conduct, all of which are also listed on the screen and we'll reference as we go through the presentation. So as I just mentioned, it's the Municipal Act that sets out the requirement for procedure bylaws. It's section 238 of the Act, and it's quite prescriptive in many instances. For example, the first bullet point on the screen, section 238.2, of course, requires every municipality to pass a procedure bylaw. And the second bullet, 238.2.1, requires that the bylaw must also provide for public notice of the meetings. So these two sections are mandatory, whereas the last bullet, section 238.3, is an optional section. It states the procedure bylaw may provide that meetings can be held and public offices be kept at a place outside of the municipality. But if this is the case, the locations must be within an adjacent municipality. And you may wonder why a municipality would choose to have their offices in a location outside of their own municipal boundaries, but it does happen. This was actually the case in my former municipality when I was the CAO of the Township of Malahide. Malahide's council chambers were located within the township, but the municipal office itself was not. You see, the township was a predominantly rural municipality that geographically surrounded the town of Aylmer. Essentially, Aylmer was the donut hole and Malahide was the donut that surrounded it. And because there was really no significant business district located within the township itself, the Malahide Council chose to have its municipal offices located in the town of Aylmer, the adjacent municipality, as it was more centralized and provided ease of access for Malahide's ratepayers who were already used to going into town to conduct their other business activities. So while not common, there are definitely instances when it makes sense to hold either meetings or have municipal offices in an adjacent municipality. So, and here are a couple of other optional sections of the Act that deal with procedure bylaws. Sections 238, 3.1 and 3.3 address electronic participation of members. Electronic participation was added to the Municipal Act a few years ago and became a vital way to conduct council meetings during COVID. We'll discuss this optional element in terms of the Brighton bylaw a bit later on in the presentation. And these next two sections of the Act are also optional. They're related to the presiding officer. This section allows for a member of council, other than the head of council, or mayor in this case, to preside at council meetings. And while again not common, there are instances when it may be appropriate to appoint another member of council, other than the head of council or mayor, to conduct meetings. And I've got another question for you. Can you think of an example when this might be appropriate to have someone other than the mayor actually conduct the meeting, even when the mayor is actually present at the meeting. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
When the mayor has an item of business they want to present to council.
That absolutely, that is it. You would then vacate the chair, of course, and carry on from there. That's right. And another example that we have thought of and we've actually experienced in the past is if the head of council is actually the subject of an integrity commissioner's report, it wouldn't be appropriate for them to chair that part of the meeting when that report was being presented as well. So excellent, that's great, thank you. So in a couple of other sections here, so section 230 of the Act states that the procedure bylaw should detail when the inaugural council meeting will be held. And again, we see in section 236(1) that council is to hold its meeting, the inaugural meeting in this instance, within the municipality or an adjacent municipality. And the location of the meeting should be set out, should actually be identified in the procedure bylaw itself. Although, of course, in the case of an emergency, council does have the option to hold any of its meetings at any convenient location, either within or outside of the municipality. Lots of leeway there. And the last section of the Municipal Act that we want to highlight tonight is section 243.1. And this does allow for the procedure bylaw to include a mechanism for proxy voting. And of course, the use of the word may in this section means that procedures are not required to include this position. Councils are allowed to if they wish. We'll be discussing some of these sections of the Municipal Act that I have referenced and how they've been addressed in Brighton's procedure bylaw a bit later on in the presentation. So bear with me. So transparency and accountability, as you are all aware, within local government is extremely important. And as I mentioned earlier, the Municipal Act actually directs that municipalities adopt transparency and accountability policies. And a strong procedure bylaw can further enhance these principles of transparency and accountability. So transparency and accountability is really about building and developing council's relationship with the public. And it's absolutely critical for council success. The procedure bylaw supports this by telling your public how municipal meetings are called, who's involved, where they happen, and how they're going to proceed. The notice policy describes the circumstances when notice is to be given and the form and the manner of times of notice. And of course, council's accountability and transparency policy describes how council will try to ensure that it is accountable to the public for its actions and how it will try to ensure that its actions are transparent. And the last policy we want to highlight is with respect to delegation, and it describes the delegation of powers and duties to either committees or individuals, including your own staff. So these policies all work to support an open and transparent governance process so that the public understands how decisions are going to be made and what they can expect from their elected officials. And of course, holding open meetings is probably the best way that council can demonstrate transparency, which is why the Municipal Act also requires that all meetings of council, local boards, and committees are to be open to the public. However, as you are aware, a meeting can be closed to the public if it satisfies one of the prescribed conditions, and if council follows the prescribed process to close that meeting. The procedure bylaw is a tool to help guide both council and the public in these situations. And we'll discuss this process in more detail a bit later on in the presentation. There are a number of fundamental meeting principles that promote transparency and accountability. Those include that the majority must be allowed to rule. The minority definitely have rights that must be respected. Members have a right to information in order to make their decisions. Courtesy and respect are required at all times. All members have equal rights, privileges, and obligations. And members have a right to have an efficient meeting. And when used effectively, the procedure bylaw provides for efficient meetings and transparent decision-making. So with that background, I'll now hand the presentation over to Michelle to walk you through some of the specifics of your procedure bylaw, the Brighton bylaw.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. So now that we've reviewed some of the more generic information about procedural bylaws and the legislative framework, let's take a look at Brighton's procedural bylaw. So the first section is your preamble, and that notes your authority to actually pass your procedural bylaw. We just wanted to point out a couple of implications here with respect to the authority. So, and Michelle's already touched on this, when you see the words shall, the municipality must do that. And when you see may within legislation, it's a discretionary power, and it's up to the municipality whether or not they want to proceed with that. So your bylaw consists of 22 articles altogether. We'll briefly review these articles, and we'll go into some detail on some of the more common ones and common occurrences that your council will experience. In the industry, the procedural bylaw is sometimes referred to as a procedural bylaw or the rules of procedure. Whatever you call it, it's absolutely important that you understand the rules governing your meetings. Article number 2 is the interpretation. And for consistency and better understanding, bylaws frequently define specific items that are used throughout the bylaw. The Brighton bylaw contains a total of 51 definitions. And as questions or concerns arise through your meetings, council and also staff might want to provide further definitions in your procedural bylaw. Article number 3 is your general provisions. And these general provisions in the Brighton bylaw are consistent with other municipal bylaws that we see. These general provisions include guiding philosophy, application of the rules, parliamentary authority, official language, seating of council members, severability of the bylaw, the Indigenous land acknowledgement that you did at the beginning of the meeting. There might be occasions where the seating of council members changes, and because that particular provision is contained in your bylaw, that's something that you might want to change to provide some flexibility in your bylaw over time. Municipalities are encouraged to have severability clauses in the regulatory bylaws. So, and what that means is if a portion of the bylaw is found by a court to be invalid, the invalid portion is void, but the remaining part of the bylaw still remains in effect. So in some cases, the procedural bylaw might not be clear and it may not address every single situation. And all procedure bylaws make reference to a secondary source. It could be Robert's Rules of Orders or Bonio's Rule of Order. Those are basically the two that are used by municipalities. Brighton's bylaw makes reference to the 11th edition of Robert's Rules of Order. And my question for council and staff is, can you recall of a situation where you've actually had to go to the Robert's Rules of Order to get some information on how to proceed on a matter? Has that ever been used by Brighton?
Not since I've been here.
Okay, and that's good. You know what, to be honest, I think I can count maybe a couple of times in my 30-year career that I've actually had to go to the secondary source. So that's normal for sure. Article 4 talks about special meetings and emergency meetings, such as who can call them and the notice required for these meetings. Just to make note, your procedural bylaw has a curfew of 9 p.m. And of course, that can be extended by suspending the rules of procedure. And as a matter of fact, any one of your procedures can be suspended at any time.
Sorry, Michelle, it looks like we did that slide out of order.
Oh, okay.
So we'll just go back to this one here. Have you got that one?
Yes. Yep. So that's the inaugural meeting. So Michelle had already highlighted the inaugural meeting, the requirement to put that into your bylaw. Also the location and the schedule, and it's really important for transparency's sake that you do have a schedule of meetings, and that's posted on your website. It's important if you can attend a meeting to let your clerk's office know. And there's a provision in your bylaws so that if you're absent for a 3 consecutive month period, there are provisions about vacating the seat. Okay, so there are provisions with respect to Article 4 about electronic meetings during an emergency. And we know that we've been talking with the clerk's office with respect to electronic meetings. Currently, you can have electronic meetings during emergency periods. And again, that was put into place because of COVID. And so this is something I think that you'll need to take a look at moving forward in terms of making a change to your procedural bylaw to allow for electronic meetings and electronic participation during non-emergency situations. Article 5 of your bylaw talks about the roles of council, head of council, chair of meetings, and also staff. So the role of councils are found in section 224 of the Municipal Act, and they are to represent the public and to consider the well-being and the interest of the municipality, develop and evaluate the policies and programs of the municipality, determine which services the municipality provides, ensure administrative policies and practices and procedures are in place, ensure the accountability and transparency of the operations, and maintain the financial integrity of the municipality. Again, that's a section 224 in the Municipal Act. Again, the role of head of council, the mayor, that can be found in section 225 of the Municipal Act, and that is something that has been included within the your procedural bylaw. So the role is to act as the chief executive officer, preside over council meetings, provide leadership to the council, maintain decorum in council chambers, to provide information and recommendations to the council with respect to the role of council, to represent the municipality at all official functions, and to carry out the duties of the head of council under this and any other act. And under section 226 of the Municipal Act, we have the role of the head of council as CEO. And as the CEO, the head of council promotes public involvement in the municipality's activities, acts as the representative of the municipality, both within and outside the municipality, and promote the municipality locally, nationally, and internationally, participate and foster activities that enhance the economic, social, and environmental well-being of the municipality and its residents. Next, we get to the chair of meetings, and there are 25 duties listed with respect to the chair of meetings. And this information in terms of the duties is taken right out of your secondary source, which is the Robert's Rules of Order. And I do assume that when you have newly appointed chairs for committees, that this information in terms of the duties is shared to the chairs. So the chair has many responsibilities, and the chair definitely sets the tone for the meetings. The chair's role is to facilitate meetings, to allow for effective participation and decision-making. And really, it's to manage time, people, as well as the agenda. The chair should be aware of the responsibilities through training or orientation, which I'm sure that you received upon inauguration. And the members have an obligation to obey the orders of the presiding officer or the chair. And the role of staff is really important. The clerk is required to record without comment all resolutions, decisions, and other proceedings of the council, document any recorded votes, keep original copies of minutes and bylaws. Of course, there are other duties that the clerk's office provides, such as the drafting and circulating of agendas, provides procedural advice, coordinates delegations and presentations. And in the absence of the clerk, the deputy clerk would exercise the same responsibilities as the clerk. The role of the chief administrative officer is to exercise general control and management of the affairs of the municipality for the purposes of ensuring the effective and efficient operation by the municipality. As you're aware, these staff roles have detailed job descriptions, but for the purposes of the procedural bylaw, those are the roles of staff. And Article 6 talks about duties. So 6.1 sets out the duties of council, and that is to come prepared. So make sure that you're looking at your agenda ahead of time and asking staff questions ahead of the meeting as well. Requests for substantive reports are to be done by council resolution. Council members do not have the authority to direct or interfere with any work by the staff. All inquiries shall be directed through the CAO. And different municipalities do that differently. Some members of council can go to other staff, such as the directors, or it's specifically to the CAO. And I was just kind of curious, is that reflected of what procedures that council follows in terms of inquiries of staff? Is it directly to the CAO, or are members of council going to different staff members?
It's it's my practice and my practice to advise other members of council that inquiries should go to the CAO and copy the director where the inquiry might end up.
Perfect. That's great. So you're absolutely following the procedure bylaw in that instance. And I like how it's copied to the member of staff as well. Great. Thank you. So the next is 6.2, and this reviews the duties of the mayor and the committee chair, which include calling to order the meeting, recognizing the speakers, announcing the results, and sometimes this results in some extra explanation, right? Especially if you've got a delegation of ratepayers who may not know the procedure bylaw or know how the voting works. As the mayor, the committee chair, you're enforcing the decorum, and we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail later on. You're going to inform on point of order, and you're going to adjourn, suspend, or recess the meeting. And 6.2.4 states what the mayor or the committee chair must do if they wish to speak or vote on any question. So they are permitted to speak and or vote on any question, which is good. But if they wish to speak on a motion or to make a motion, they must first leave the chair by designating the deputy chair. And if the deputy chair is absent, by designating another member to act in their stead. Then, once the issue has been fully resolved, the mayor or committee chair can resume to the chair. So in, just as an example, in the municipality that I'm on council for, our procedure allows for a bit more of a informal process and allows the mayor or the chair to speak without having to leave the chair. And again, my question to the group is that particular procedure followed in terms of if the chair wants to speak, are you leaving the chair to do so?
I do not.
Okay. And there's nothing wrong with that. I was just asking that. Okay.
But we should probably incorporate that in the procedure bylaw if that's been the practice.
I would think so. And we'll get to that a little bit later on too, in terms of, you know, this is a good opportunity to kind of go through the bylaw. And if you're not acting in a way that you're following it, then I would suggest that that's something that you might want to change. Okay, Article 7 is decorum, and it includes some matters about, you know, no person shall be allowed to approach members or staff or council during a meeting. All members shall wear proper business attire for both males and females, and ties are optional. There might be a need for that to be updated if that's not what you're following. But typically, these are items that relate to behavior. It might be more appropriate to be contained in your code of conduct as opposed to a procedural bylaw. I also wanted to point out too, that Article 7 talks about conduct concerning the public. And there are 9 rules with respect to that. And I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. And I also want to make sure that the public is aware of that too. So if there are 9 rules, I'm not sure how that gets communicated, whether I'm not in the council chambers, so I'm not sure if there's signage or whether there's advanced written communication between the clerk and the public. But I just wanted to point out that that's in the bylaw.
Just by way of information, I suspect those 9 rules were inserted in there because of some concerning behavior we had with the public a few terms ago.
Okay, that's a good reference point, and that's usually why we take a look at amending our procedural bylaws to allow just for that, right? Those changing conditions. Thank you. Okay, Article 7 talks about conduct during meetings. So it also requires members to obey the rules of procedure and includes language to encourage healthy, respectful debate amongst the council members. Article 7.12 sets out the rules for use of technology during council and committee meetings. And I was happy to hear that the mayor announced that at the beginning of the meeting, which is excellent. The article also sets out the obligation, again, for the council to listen to and to obey the presiding officer. Article 8 talks about rules of debate. So most of the section in this article are actually pretty straightforward, but we did want to highlight just a couple of things. So section 8.3 clarifies that the member who moves the main motion has the first right of speaking to that motion, and the seconder has the right of speaking second. The mover then has the last right to speak to the motion. Section 8.10 helps to ensure that the debate does not get bogged down, as it clearly indicates that no member shall speak to the same question or in reply to a question for no longer than 5 minutes. And then section 8.11 facilitates informed decision-making by allowing a member to ask a question through the chair for the purpose of obtaining information relating to the motion under discussion. And then questions, of course, can be asked only of the chair, staff, and a previous speaker or delegation or presentation. So I was just curious again on 8.3, is that procedure being followed in terms of when a councillor puts forward a motion? Is it the mover that gets to speak first, the seconder second, and then do you ask the mover to speak again at the end?
Well, I'll break it down. On substantive motions, the answer is almost yes, sort of almost yes. So a motion brought by a member of council specifically to make a policy change or what have you, I would ask the mover if they would like to speak to their motion. I do not then necessarily go to the seconder, so I will change my nasty ways.
No, and you don't need to. I mean, again,
No,
we'll talk.
I think if it's right there, we should do it.
Yeah.
And I have never asked the mover if they would like to speak last. So I will again adjust how we move forward.
Yeah. Well, and I give I know mayors and chairs a lot of credit, because there's a lot of moving parts to a meeting, right? So sometimes even to keep track of who is moving and who seconded it, and then keeping track in terms of the 5 minutes. It's a lot for the head of council to keep track of. Okay.
We have resolution sheets that are right in front of me, so that's the part is actually the easy part.
That helps.
But I surely do not track the time people are speaking. In fairness, we have an exceptional crew around the Horseshoe, and so I like to give pretty decent leeway, so that everyone has their time to say what they need to say or ask the questions they need to ask. And that way, I think we feel that we've come to a consensus, or at least been able to provide our arguments. So it's unlikely that I'm ever, in this term of council anyway, I'm ever going to stick to that 5 minute rule. Certainly in the last term of council, I may have once or twice, but that was a different level of personality around the Horseshoe. So good crew this time. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, it sounds like it. And that's how you make really good decisions, right? When you allow people to have that leeway to, provide their information and their points of opinion. So that's excellent. Thank you so much. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Michelle. So Article 9 deals with closed meetings. Excuse me. And we mentioned earlier in the presentation that the Municipal Act requires all council and committee meetings to be open to the public, unless, of course, the subject matter falls within one of the limited exceptions, and providing that council follows the prescribed process to close that meeting. So it's important that council members be familiar with the list of permitted matters for which a closed meeting may be held. And there are a number of them, and we actually thought it was important to just quickly run through them. So then this slide and the next one actually includes all of them. So the first one is, of course, security of municipal property, personal matters about an identifiable individual, then proposed or pending acquisition or disposal of land, labor relations or employee negotiations, litigation or potential litigation, advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege, a matter permitted under another act to be considered in a closed meeting, information explicitly supplied in confidence by Canada, province or territory, or a Crown agency. Oh, sorry. There we go. As well, a trade secret. This is a big one. A trade secret or scientific, technical, commercial, financial, or labor relations information that's supplied in confidence, and this is the key, the next part, which, if disclosed, could be expected to prejudice significantly a competitive position. So that's the key. So it's not a matter of whether you just received information in confidence, but it's if it was disclosed, it would prejudice significantly a competitive position. So that's the key to that one. The next one is a trade secret or scientific, technical, commercial, or financial information, again, that in this case belongs to the municipality and has monetary value or potential monetary value. A potential example of that is, in some instances, there are municipalities that have developed software that to be able to use with their organization, and they may decide at some point in the future to possibly sell that to other municipalities. And if that was the case, you're able to discuss and deal with that in closed session at the beginning. The next item is a position, plan, procedure, criteria, or instruction to be applied to any negotiation. It's not specific in terms of the type of negotiation. And then the last two is training and education purposes without advancing business or council decision making. And of course, consideration of a freedom of information request. So those are your limited exceptions. And in addition to spelling out all of those exceptions, Article 9 also identifies the required process that council should follow in order to move into a closed meeting. All council and committee meetings must begin and end in public. But in order to move into a closed meeting, a motion must be made in public, and that motion must state the nature of the closed session to be considered. Then a procedural motion is required to rise from that closed session and move back into the public session. Again, meaning you begin and end in public. So I also want to remind council members that all voting should be done, or must be done, not should, must be done in public session, unless it's restricted to procedural matters or for given instructions or directions to staff or possibly other agents of the municipality, such as maybe your solicitor. This aspect of making sure everything is done in open session where you can really supports, again, the principles of transparency and accountability. So, and also in support of Article 9, we want to note that Brighton has established a detailed closed meeting protocol. Your clerk was very kind to provide us with a copy of it. And while we're not proposing to go through that protocol this evening, because I understand you've spent a fair bit of time in the last number of months making sure it's up to date, we do want to mention that this type of document is a really valuable tool for both members of council and staff when you're dealing with closed session issues. it does provide very detailed guidelines and information about the statutory requirements and best practices associated with meetings that are closed to the public. We want to commend you and your staff for putting that protocol together. And Article 10 of your procedure bylaw deals with confidentiality and actually specifies repercussions if a council member were to violate confidentiality. This section provides guidance to members of council if they receive an inquiry about a closed session matter. I anticipate that members of council already use the recommended responses regularly, but we felt it was important to highlight them just the same, as it can sometimes be challenging when being questioned about a closed session matter by either the media or maybe a member of the public. So the correct response for any inquiry about a matter that's being dealt with in closed session should always be either this matter is under advisement or simply no comment. And while it's difficult to be able to refrain from making any other comments, or it really is important to maintain that confidentiality. And Article 10 of your bylaw does actually establish repercussions or penalties for a violation of confidentiality. And this type of language and level of detail is not something that we usually see in procedure bylaws. Typically, we would see these types of penalties included in a council code of conduct, but wherever you have it, it's important that they be acknowledged. So Article 11 addresses the general order of business, or essentially is about the meeting agenda. The Municipal Act does not set out requirements for council meeting agendas. However, there are some other procedural rules, such as Robert's Rules of Order, that do provide guidance for managing meeting agendas. Your procedure bylaw does assist elected officials and municipal staff to clearly understand how to add and how to manage the agenda. And Article 11.3 actually allows for modifications to be made to items on the agenda without requiring an amendment to the procedure bylaw. In Section 11.3.8 relates to citizen comments and question period. And this section allows members of the public to comment or ask questions of council through the chair without debating or offering criticism regarding any matter that's on the agenda. To facilitate that discussion, there are a number of rules of procedure that the chair is required to outline beforehand. And public members must state their name for the meeting record, although citizen comments do not form part of the meeting minutes. And in our experience, not a lot of councils still hold open question period or allow members of the public to make general comments if they were not a scheduled delegation. Michelle and I are interested to know the number of comments or questions that you routinely receive from the public and whether members of council find this to be a really good process to receive, or a good method essentially to receive input from the public. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? We're curious to see how well this works for Brighton.
We don't receive a lot of comments anymore. We certainly used to. I would say in the last 2 or 3 terms, we received at least one citizen's comment every single council meeting, usually from the same person.
Yes, we refer to those ones as frequent flyers.
Yes, well, there you are. Aren't you kind? But this term of council, I think we've received 2, okay, a total. So we're almost a year in now.
Yeah, and it's something that council might want to think about. I mean, it's important to hear from the public, but we also, our experience has been that in some instances it can get a little out of hand at times. So if you decided to adjust that process, recognizing that you're not receiving a lot of input, you may want to think about other ways to allow public to provide input or comments, as opposed to just a wide open question period where, you're sometimes caught a little off guard, or if certain questions that might be asked, you may not actually be prepared for. So just some food for thought as you're going forward and looking at your bylaw and some of the provisions as you consider changes.
As you read the sections around both of those, we have a pretty strict rule around what can be asked, what can't be asked, and what questions
Yes.
will be answered. So citizens' comment is just an opportunity for exactly that, comment without comment from council. And it's 2 minutes, so it does with a maximum
Yes,
of 10.
yes.
And then question period is also capped at.
And I'm not trying to suggest, like I said, and if you find it to be valuable and useful, then absolutely. Is that it's just something that we don't see as much of anymore. And so just wanted to note that for you.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see where council wants to go with that, quite frankly, because I wouldn't want to see it go away entirely, but we may want to massage having two, like there's 2 opportunities at every council meeting. We may want to massage that anyway. Thank you. I appreciate
Just
your
some things
comments on that.
to know. Yep. So Article 11 also provides for the use of a consent agenda. So you're a year into your term already, so you obviously have seen several consent agendas. And this, of course, as you're aware, allows councils to make brief comments regarding agenda items, but also, as you know, if a member wishes to debate an agenda item, then of course it has to be removed from the consent agenda, and then it will be debated and voted on separately. So Article 11 also outlines how resolutions from other municipalities are to be listed on your agenda, and definitely clarifies that council's receipt of those motions does not constitute endorsement. Another part of it indicates that staff may prepare recommendations related to a resolution from another municipality for council's consideration. And in our experience, it's more likely that council will ask staff for a recommendation rather than staff just simply initiating one, as it's sometimes difficult for staff to know which resolutions council members would want to support or not. So we note that it's allowed that a staff member can just prepare a recommendation, but I think in our experience, we would probably recognize that it doesn't happen very often. And usually it's when recommendations are prepared, it's in response to council, actually a council member asking for one to be initiated. And a couple of other quick things. So Article 11 also provides guidance, of course, on handling notices of motions. They must be submitted by council members prior to the agenda deadline of 12 noon on Monday, week prior to the scheduled meeting. And the article also states that the clerk shall accept items for the agenda from any staff member or from members of council, of course, up until the agenda deadline of 4 p.m. on Wednesday. Although normally it specifies staff and members of council, but we're going to suggest that normally council would likely add their item through the notice of motion, which is to be submitted a couple of days earlier than that. And one comment that we would like to make is that the internal process of developing an agenda probably doesn't really need to be addressed as part of the procedure bylaw. There's a lot of detail in terms of how the agenda is actually prepared. In our experience, internal processes tend to change a little more frequently, and having them spelled out in the procedure bylaw actually means that any change to that internal process would require an amendment to the bylaw, which may or may not be a good use of time. And a lot of internal processes we don't see typically included in the actual bylaws themselves. Just a little bit more information as you're kind of reviewing things. So the next article is Article 12, and it speaks to quorum. A majority of council members obviously constitutes quorum, and the procedure bylaw does recognize an exception to that rule. If there are members with a conflict of interest and are unable to participate, then it's the remaining number of members, and the remaining number of members is not sufficient to constitute quorum, then despite any other act, the remaining number of members shall be deemed to constitute quorum if that number is not less than 2. So that's a lot of words, but essentially, if there are a number of members of council with conflicts of interest, such that there actually wouldn't be able to maintain a normal quorum, as long as there are enough members, not less than 2, you're able to continue with that part of the meeting. So in Article 12 also states that electronic participation of council members is allowed to be counted for quorum. And I do have a question for you. So Brighton has 7 members of council. With a 7-member council, how many members would have to be present to achieve quorum in a normal situation?
4.
Anyone?
We're going to say 4.
4 members is correct. Now let's change it up a little bit and say, how about if 1 member of council discloses a pecuniary interest, leaving 6 members to be able to, what would quorum be if you had 6 members remaining?
I feel like this is a trick question. I think it's still 4.
And you're correct. And it was a little bit of a trick question. A lot of times we ask this question and somebody will say 3 because that's half, but that only is half. And of course, a majority has to be more than half. And so, yes, it would still be 4 in that instance. You're absolutely correct. Good job. So Article 13 is all about council minutes. And providing council members and the public with meeting minutes, again, supports local government transparency and accountability. You're going to hear me use these words a lot tonight. And having clear processes around minutes in procedure bylaws really provides guidance and expectations to council, the staff, and the public. The clerk, of course, is responsible for preparing the actual minutes. And those minutes should record what was done at the meeting by council as a collective group, and not on what each individual member said or did. The requirement to take minutes applies to all meetings, and those minutes are to be included in the agenda for adoption at the next regular meeting. And once adopted, of course, all minutes are to be signed by the mayor and the presiding officer and the clerk. So the next article, Article 14, outlines a process for delegations and presentations to be made to council. The procedure bylaw includes a form attachment as one of your appendices that is required to be completed by any person who wishes to make a delegation. And of course, the deadline for delegations is no later than Wednesday at 4, which is the agenda deadline, the week preceding the meeting. And generally, your procedure bylaw says there should be no more than 2 delegations or presentations at any given meeting, and the time limit for presentations is 15 minutes. Article 14.1.4 of the Brighton bylaw actually allows the clerk to deny a request for a delegation in certain circumstances, and there are a number of them. So that's where the subject matter is not within the jurisdiction of the actual municipality, where the subject matter involves litigation or potential litigation, and/or the matter is before the actual courts, where the request is financial in nature and falls under the grants aid program, with the requester having actually missed the application deadline. And we sometimes see that happen if somebody hasn't had an opportunity to meet the application deadline, they want to be able to appeal to council directly. Where the subject matter has already been presented within the term of council by the delegate, unless of course new information is being presented. But this of course helps to streamline processes and make sure that delegations aren't coming back meeting after meeting after meeting to be able to tell you the same thing that you've already heard or already decided on. The next one is where the delegate wishes to have a prior decision of council rescinded. They're not to be dealing with it that way. It's council that decides whether or not they wish to take that action. And when there is a tender or an RFP, which is either proposed, pending, or actually before council for consideration. And the final one is if the matter is related to labor relations, contract negotiations, or an insurance claim. So the language in this article is not something that we've really come across previously in our other procedure bylaws. In our experience, this level of detail is usually spelled out in an internal document rather than in the procedure bylaw itself. However, again, for transparency reasons, we feel that there is definitely benefit to clearly stating the types of scenarios where the clerk would deny a request for delegation, whether it's in an internal document or in the actual procedure bylaw itself. And I'll turn it over to Michelle to walk you through some of the more interesting sections coming up dealing with motions.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Yes, and I do think that this is more interesting, and because I think this is the most important part of your procedural bylaw, and it is concerning motions and voting. So I know that you've been in the role for almost a year now, and you understand what motions are, but we want to just kind of briefly review and go into a bit more detail on the different kinds of motions. And probably by the end of the meeting, we'll have you transitioned into clerks in no time. So what do motions mean? So a motion is a proposal by a member of the group. It's a statement that describes an action or a decision. It's how decisions are made amongst the committee or council. And some of the basic rules for motions are, it should be positive. You can only have one person speak at a time, and you can't raise another motion until all other motions are settled or adjourned. And your procedural bylaw, as mentioned by the mayor already, has the members of council, you need to submit your motions on the prescribed form provided by the clerk's office. This is a listing of some of the common types of motions, and these are, most of them are addressed in the Brighton's procedural bylaw. So we have main motion, an amendment, amend the amendment, refer to a committee, call the question, postpone indefinitely, point of order, point of privilege, reconsider, suspend the rules, and adjourn. So what is the main motion? It's a basic form of motion whose introduction brings business before council. It's the most important form of motion and the one that is used most frequently. So we're going to use an example to help explain main motions and amendments and an amendment to the amendment, because it can get kind of complicated. So as an example, let's say that the main motion being moved is that the municipality of Brighton purchase 10 sets of pickleball rackets. So what's an amendment? It's a motion to modify the wording of a pending motion. And how do you modify a motion? You can add, strike out, or substitute. So if we want to modify it, let's continue on with our example. So let's say that a councillor moves to amend the motion by substituting 10 sets of pickleball rackets to 5 sets of pickleball rackets. So we're substituting the 10 for 5. And this rarely happens. I think with my experience, this has only happened a couple of times, and usually it's in larger municipalities. But there's something called amending the amendment. So it's a motion to modify the wording of an amendment, and it's called a secondary amendment. So going back to our example, let's say a councillor moves that we purchase used pickleball rackets and not purchase new ones. So you can only amend the amendment once. So once this is done, then the chair would call the motion on the amendment to the amendment, which is to purchase used pickleball rackets. So that vote is taken. And then the motion on the amendment to purchase the reduced number of 5 rackets is called. And then the main motion as amended would be called. I know we've used an example there, but does that make it sort of clear in terms of main motion, amendment, and the amending the amendment? Any questions on that? And it's probably typical that you're only dealing with the main motion. But I would be interested to know, does your council use amendments to the main motion, or have you done that within your first year?
Well, I'll answer that question, but I think Councillor Wheeldon has a question or comment.
I do. I was just wondering, in the description you gave of your example, it sounds like there were 3 votes there.
Correct.
Okay. Usually we would just look around the table and say, does everyone agree to that amendment?
Yeah.
And then vote once on the entire.
We go the friendly amendment route.
Oh, we're going to talk about that next, as a matter of fact. So if I mean, maybe we'll get to that slide, Michelle, the friendly amendment. So in our experience, there really is no such thing as a friendly amendment. But in saying that, I've seen procedural bylaws that say that friendly amendments are allowed. So if that's what you do, then maybe that's something that you want to incorporate into your procedural bylaw. Because If your procedural bylaw does not allow for the friendly amendment, then really you need to have 3 votes on each of those things before making a final decision, if that's clear.
Thank you. That's been our practice has been to go the friendly amendment route, because by the time you debate the main motion, there's a concept, there's usually a concept out there to change it slightly.
Yes.
And so my practice is simply ask the mover and seconder if they're okay with that change. 9 times plus out of 10, the answer is yes. And so we just strike it out. I either reread the motion as it's been changed, or I advise council of the change for the record, and then we vote.
Yeah, and that's great. That's great. You just might want to change your procedural bylaw to allow for that. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So Article 16 is motions. So we talked about main motions, and so we'll briefly talk about some other motions that you might encounter as part of your meeting proceedings. So the first one we're going to talk about is a subsidiary motion. So this assists in treating or changing the main motion, which we talked about already. One of those examples is an amendment to the motion. Other ones include postponing for a certain time, limit or extend limits of debate, call, state the question, lay on the table. And so my question for you is, aside from the amending the motion, the main motion, has your council dealt with any of these other subsidiary motions? Have you had to actually ask council to call the question?
We've never had a motion to call the question, just someone yelling, call the question. Which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, depending on the mood of the chair.
Yeah.
But we have done referrals, and we've done postponements or deferrals as well.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on then to privilege motions. So privilege motions, so this class of motion does not relate to the pending business, but rather to items of immediate importance that should be allowed to interrupt the business. And in Brighton, these include raise a question of privilege, recess, or to adjourn. And there are a couple, like there are point of general privilege, which refers to everyone, and then a point of personal privilege that we'll get into next. So with respect to the personal privilege, I guess, sorry, just if we go back just for a second there, Michelle. So an example of this is if a member of council feels as if they're not being treated in a really respectful way, they can bring this up as a point of privilege to have that matter dealt with before proceeding on with any further business. And in that case, then it's going to be the chair that would make a decision on that matter. Okay, so we'll get to incidental motions, and these motions are related to procedure. This class of motions relate to the pending question in such a way that it must be decided immediately before any other business intervenes. And they include point of order, a point of information, appeal the decision of the chair, withdraw a motion, suspend the rules, and the division of a question. And we've put the associated articles with respect to those incidental motions on the screen. So, okay. Under point of order then. So an example of an incidental motion is point of order. So a member of council may move a point of order if they see that a public member is speaking longer than the required 2 minutes. Remember, we talked about that with respect to the public consultation period. In this case, there's no seconder, and the presiding officer rules the point of order. I mean, so obviously the the presiding officer can ask the public member to wrap things up, or to indicate that yes, your 2 minutes is up, and then call the next person up. So that's just an example of point of order that's contained in your procedural bylaw. So what are bring back motions? This is includes reconsideration, rescind, amend something previously adopted, take from the table, and discharge a committee. A motion to reconsider is an example of a bring back motion. The motion to reconsider enables only council and not committees within a limited time and without notice to bring back for further consideration a motion that has already been voted on. A motion to reconsider can only be used in the same meeting at which the decided matter has occurred as per the Brighton Procedural Bylaw. And what Michelle and I wanted to point out here is normally procedural bylaws allow for reconsideration at a subsequent meeting because sometimes council makes decisions with the best information at that time. And sometimes there might be additional information provided after the fact or after the meeting, or perhaps there's some negative feedback that you receive from the public and you think that there's a need to reconsider the matter. So that's something that you might want to take into account is giving yourself some more time in order to take a look at those motions to reconsider. A motion to reconsider resolution can only be made by a member who voted on the prevailing side or a member who did not vote. So again, that's taken right out of your procedural bylaw. Michelle and I, we question that because usually if you don't vote, that's a negative vote. So that's something that you might want to take a look at or remove. If a motion to reconsider has been adopted, it temporarily nullifies the previous decision and then places the meeting back to the point prior to taking the vote. And the original matter shall become before council as the next order of business. So no motion or report shall be considered more than once at any meeting. So I just had a question. Has your council had to deal with a motion to reconsider within your first term or the first year of your term?
That I can recall.
Okay, good. Okay, because
Hang on. The clerk may be correcting me.
Okay.
Well, you didn't call it a reconsideration, but there was a planning issue, remember, and you were trying to take it up open it up in the minutes. But I said it should be a reconsideration. That's what that would have been. But because you were right in our procedural bylaw, it said you had to do the reconsideration at that meeting. So that's something we need to review.
You may.
Yeah, I would think that's something that you might want to take a look at. Again,
and Councillor Butwell has a comment.
Sure.
Hello, Ann Butwell. How are you? So we had made a decision at a planning meeting and there was, I can't remember, was it additional information or there was something and, in the spirit of a sober second thought, tried to reopen it and reverse the decision, wanting to readdress the issue. But the bylaw had already been signed at that point by the time the next meeting happened a week later. So we didn't have the opportunity to do so.
Right, and that's actually a really good point. So you can't reconsider a matter that's already been fully executed or implemented as well.
Yeah, I did not know that at the time.
Yeah.
I
And now
didn't
you
know
did.
that it had been signed.
Okay, so the last motion that we will review is the notice of motion, and Michelle touched upon this at the beginning of the presentation. So a notice of motion shall be introduced by a member at a meeting. The notice should be received by the clerk by 4 p.m. on the Monday 1 week prior to the council meeting date to be included on the agenda. If the notice of motion is not filed in time, then it will be considered at the next meeting. The purpose for listing on the agenda is notice to the public and just to let them know that item will be discussed. Of course, you can always suspend the rules to allow a notice of motion, and that can be proceeded with if there's a majority vote. And we've had some experiences in our first term of council. We've had quite a few different notices of motions that have been presented by council. And some members of council felt that it was really time sensitive, that we move ahead with those notices of motion, even though they didn't get it in on time to get it printed on the agenda. And so that's what happened in a couple of our situations, is that we suspended the rules to allow the notice of motion. And just a question, do you, as a council, do you see lots of notices of motion?
Yeah, they're fairly frequently used by council to advance public policy positions.
Good, good.
Yeah, Councillor Wheeldon.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Ostrander. I'm curious about the time. I mean, I know it was just stated it's there to alert the public that this will be addressed, but every motion is on our agenda within a certain number of days prior to the meeting, and made available to the public. But the ones that council brings forward through a notice of motion are effectively on there for an extra 2 weeks. So what's special about ours? Typically, we don't have a long report that's attached to ours either.
I can speak to that, Jeff. Again, this was from a former council, term of council, where we had certain council members that would bring notice or motions or notice of motions that night, and then one of them debated on that night, and the other council members did not have a chance to review it, either did the public. So that's why we went this route.
Yeah, and actually, this is what's common. I think with senior bylaw is what's common. All I was just suggesting is, in some cases, what I've seen, and just with my council, we've only been a year in, but sometimes there is some urgency on the part of council to want to, proceed with a notice of motion. But I absolutely agree. I think that the whole idea in terms of transparency is that we should be providing notice to the public to say, you know what, we're going to be talking about this item. And then it gives the public that opportunity to either contact a member of council or come to a meeting. So what's in the Brighton bylaw is something that we consistently see with other procedural bylaws for sure.
And we do suspend the rules sometimes with that. So if by quorum of council, they want to move that motion forward, that meeting, then we have done that before.
Yeah, that's good. And that gives you some flexibility, right? There might be a time constraint and you might need to do that without providing the notice. Great, thank you. So that was a lot of information about motions. And I just wanted to let you know that each motion does have a rank. We could spend another hour on motions. I know you don't want to do that, but there are rules associated with all the different motions. And I just wanted to point out, attached to your procedure bylaw, Schedule F is a motion table. It talks about precedents and the rules associated with those motions. Michelle.
Okay, thank you. So I'm still going to talk about resolutions for a moment, even though Michelle has actually spoke about the individual types of motions. Article 17 of your bylaw provides some additional guidance when dealing with resolutions. So it indicates that all motions are to be debated separately, and as well, all motions that are presented to council are to be numbered consecutively on a yearly basis. And this is a common practice that we see with most municipalities. And it actually facilitates the record keeping and the tracking of council decisions within your council minutes by actually numbering them on a yearly basis. In Article 18, now we'll talk a little bit about voting on motions. So Section 243 of the Municipal Act states that, except as otherwise provided, every member of council shall have one vote. And the decisions, of course, of council are made by the majority of council members present at that meeting. All voting is to be done in open session by a show of hands. That's in your procedure bylaw. And this approach supports, again, the transparency and accountability requirements of council. If there happens to be a tie vote, that vote is deemed to have been lost. And if a member abstains or fails to vote, it's deemed to be a negative vote, as Michelle mentioned earlier. Recorded votes are called in alphabetical order, with the chair always voting last. And as per Section 1816, the mayor or chair can, but they're not obliged to vote whenever their vote will affect the outcome. For example, the chair can vote to either break or cause a tie, or in the case of a majority vote requirement, they can vote either to cause or to block that majority vote. And Article 19 deals with municipal bylaws. And again, pursuant to Section 233(5) of the Municipal Act, your procedural bylaw requires that all Brighton bylaws must comply with the provisions of any relevant act. Bylaws do not have to be read in their entirety unless a majority vote of council requires it. And although the procedure bylaw notes that only one reading is necessary for each bylaw, the procedure bylaw itself was actually given 3 readings, and we find that this is a pretty common practice in most Ontario municipalities as well. Article 20 gets into disclosures of pecuniary interest. And these provisions reflect the obligations of council members as outlined in the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. So if a member has a pecuniary interest in a matter, they're required to disclose the interest and the general nature thereof, to not take part in any discussion or any voting on any questions with respect to that matter, and not to attempt to influence the voting on the matter. As well, the member must file a written statement of pecuniary interest with the clerk. It's to be submitted on the prescribed form so that it can be included in the register of pecuniary statements and made available for public inspection. Again, this requirement supports transparency and accountability. And the process is a bit different when there's a pecuniary interest with respect to a closed meeting matter. So unlike an open session, the council member is not permitted to stay to listen during any of the discussions. They must leave the closed meeting for the entire duration that the matter is under consideration. And another point to remember is that if you're absent from a meeting, when a matter that you have a pecuniary interest is discussed, you are required to disclose that pecuniary interest at the very first meeting that you attend after that first particular meeting. And the point of this section is to ensure that the public is always able to be aware of any pecuniary interest that council members may have, regardless of whether they were actually in attendance at the meeting when the matter was discussed. So Article 21 provides additional guidance around committees. The procedure bylaw clearly states that the mayor is ex officio on all committees, and although their attendance does not actually count towards quorum. And municipal staff members are not members of committees, but rather they act only as advisors, or they're utilized to support the committee, such as maybe a recording secretary. And your procedure bylaw also defines ad hoc committees of council, advisory committees, and statutory committees. And Article 22 specifies some of the more general requirements for council and committee meetings. So it does state that audio recording equipment is allowed to be used to record open meetings. And actually it requires that all council, committee of the whole, and planning meetings are to be audio recorded, with the retention being 1 year. It's important to note, though, that the audio recording is not considered as an official record of the meeting. It's actually the formal written minutes that constitute the official record. The audio is just a reference point. And Article 22 also requires that notice of council and committee meetings and notice of any changes to the rules of procedure must be posted on Brighton's website not less than 48 hours in advance of the meeting. And Article 23, the last article of your procedure bylaw. So this one simply rescinds the previous procedure bylaw and clarifies that if council wishes to amend or rescind this current bylaw, the notice of the proposed amendment or rescindment must be given in accordance with Article 22(3) that I just mentioned, that being the 48-hour notice on the municipal website. And of course, the only exception to this rule is in the case of a declared emergency. So the Brighton Procedure Bylaw also includes, as Michelle alluded to earlier, a number of schedules that provide additional information to further support the various sections of the bylaw. So you have Schedule A, which is instructions for delegations and petitions that to be made to council. Schedule B is instructions for those that want to make a presentation to council. Schedule C is the notice of motion form that Michelle mentioned earlier that should be completed by members of council if they want something added to the agenda. Schedule D is the declaration of pecuniary interest form that I just mentioned a moment ago. And of course, Schedule F is the motions table that Michelle mentioned earlier that identifies the ranking and the order of precedence for the various types of motions. And Schedule G is the emergency electronic meeting protocol. So this schedule actually provides additional guidance for council members and the public when electronic meetings are being held. So as I said at the beginning of the presentation, we're going to conclude with some remarks on what we think are best practices insofar as they relate to procedure bylaws. Michelle, over to you.
Great, thanks, Michelle. So generally, it's a best practice to proactively make changes to the procedural bylaw. However, in some cases, staff or elected officials may determine that a section of the procedure bylaw needs to be updated based on an issue or concern that has arisen. If council is thinking of changing the procedure bylaw, we suggest that you consider whether changes need to be made when new meeting techniques and technologies are introduced. For example, electronic meeting agendas. Consider an appropriate time when council can work together to discuss ways to improve the procedural bylaw. For example, will that look like a workshop or a strategic planning session? Provide ongoing training through regular review of specific sessions of the bylaw to help council members stay current, better understand and determine if each section is still effective. And set a timeline for an in-depth review of sections. The general rule of thumb is try to do it annually if you can, but at least once per term of council. So having spent about a year now with your procedural bylaw, this is likely an ideal time to think about the procedures that you would like to change or revisit. We see that later on in your agenda, you'll be dealing with a staff report that recommends a scheduling of a committee of the whole meeting to do just that, which is awesome. So that members of council can provide input for areas of improvement to establish a more functional bylaw for this term of council. We do consider this to be a proactive review as a best practice and would support your staff's recommendation. So when designing your procedural bylaw, we just want you to consider some items. So ensure the elements of the bylaw content are included in terms of the sections of the legislation and the municipal act, and Brighton has done that really well. The objective is to facilitate, and not frustrate meetings. So if you're finding that there's something in your procedure that's bogging you down, the contents is necessary as it provides the content in a really clear sequence. Again, having the table of contents makes it really easy and quick to look up items or definitions. Usually you get a question when you're right in the middle of a meeting. And so you want to make sure that you can get to that definition or that section of the bylaw as quickly as you can. And then there's no mandatory requirement to review your bylaw, but the general rule of thumb is to do it at least once every council term or as the need arises. And so we have 7 critical rules for writing bylaws. And again, these are bylaws in general, but still could be applied to your procedural bylaw. So you know your municipality. So make sure to include those components that reflect those items. So for example, if you find that you're formal in terms of meeting procedure, then make sure that you've got those formal rules. If you're a bit informal, then maybe take a look at changing that. And everything doesn't need to be in the bylaw. We talked about this, your dress code or your internal agenda process, for example. Those are things that don't need to be included. Try to avoid contradictions and omissions. If there is a contradiction and or omission, that's okay. That's when you can make use of your secondary resource to take a look and see what you need to do. Arrange the content in articles and sections logically. So you don't want to see notice of motion at the beginning of the bylaw and then again at the end. You want to try to incorporate notices of motion under the one article. That way you won't run into any conflicts. And when you need to find a section really quickly, you know exactly where to find it rather than having to read the entire bylaw. And keep the future in mind. We don't have a crystal ball, but take a look at the changing conditions. For example, if the municipal act is looking at increased transparency, then ensure you include those items to deliver that. And lastly, understand that legislated requirements apply and do your best to adhere to those requirements, and understand that you don't necessarily have to include those requirements, such as the municipal act provisions. So we want to close our presentation by reminding Council that this webinar was developed for general education purposes and does not constitute legal or business advice. We have prepared the presentation based on our best professional advice and experience, but again, we are not lawyers. If council members or staff require formal legal advice on any matters discussed, we recommend that you speak to your municipal solicitor. So we know that we've covered a lot of content during this presentation in a short period of time. So now we'd like to open it up to questions that you might have about the presentation or anything with respect to your procedural bylaw.
Well, thank you both. We appreciate you coming virtually at least and providing us with this information. Your disclaimer at the end sounds like the end of an American pharmaceutical ad. I really appreciate that. Members of council, any questions, clarification at this stage? Councillor Wheeldon.
Something that I thought of after we had moved on, I thought I'd save it for the end. 7.11.11 about refraining from using technology. It specifically says to communicate with other members of council or committees or members of the public. And the specificity there makes me think that it's not just a matter of decorum or respect for the meeting, but that there is concern, some legal concern about outside communication, or is that a general description of using your phone?
I'll maybe jump in just quickly. Again, I wouldn't necessarily say there's a legal issue because we're not going to comment specifically on legal concerns. But I think generally refraining from the use of technology is it's a respect thing and helps to keep everyone's attention focused. We see these types of provisions in many different procedure bylaws, and yours, while it specifically indicates to communicate with others, I think just in general, it's good protocol and good practice just to set the phones aside and focus on the discussions and the debate that's going on. You have some provisions in your bylaw that talk about how public should interact with council members. And if you were to be using your phone to have members of the public interact with council in the middle of the meeting, then it really does kind of contravene those provisions as well. So it's just good protocol, good practice to, although like I said, I'm not aware of any legal issue, although again, it's that situation. If you are concerned about the legalities aspect, we would suggest contacting a municipal solicitor on that. Michelle, anything else to?
Well, it's just that transparency piece, right? So I think it's important that if you're going to have a discussion, you have it in an open forum, like around the council table, as opposed to, sending a text to a fellow councillor or to a staff person.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from members of council? Councillor Wright.
There we go. I just have a question about 3.1.3, addressing the chair. This is something that's been on my mind for the last few years, actually. The term "your worship." How much is that still being used in today's day and age? I've heard it used only a few times here, but I find it such a colonial, antiquated, awful way of addressing somebody.
If I can jump in through your worship, there we are. I think it's becomes a habit, and for some of us that have been around the game for a lot longer, 30 years ago when I was a younger municipal administrator, everyone used the term "your worship." That was just the regular thing. Over time, of course, you're right. Different practices, different approaches are taken. And I find now that it's individuals that are my age that tend to still use the term "your worship" as opposed to Mr. or Madam Mayor or, your chair, through the chair, whichever the case may be. So we do note, I think, and Michelle will agree with me, that some of the younger individuals that are getting involved in councils and administrations tend not to use that term as frequently as some of us older ones that were brought up with that term, and it just becomes a habit more so than anything else. But there is no right or wrong, and certainly your bylaw addresses multiple versions, and it's at the comfort. There's actually some heads of council that really aren't comfortable in being called your worship and would prefer to be called Mr. Mayor or Madam Mayor, and so I think it's a matter of how the individual members of council choose to relate with one another, but it is being phased out, I think, over time. It's just old habits die hard for myself.
Thank you.
It is an odd honorific. I say that as the one who gets called it from time to time. So it seems much higher than it should be. And you're right, it comes from a colonial area, but we are a colonial institution at the end of the day. So we have to recognize and own that as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. Any other questions from members of council? Well, thank you both very much. Very insightful.
Well, we hope that we have provided you with some things to think about. We did recognize, and Michelle mentioned earlier, that your council has, or your agenda for after we're completed our presentation this evening, there's a staff recommendation to conduct a more detailed review and come up with some recommendations on areas that you might want to make changes to improve and make your meetings run a little bit more efficiently and effectively. And we hope that we have been able to provide you with a little bit of insights this evening on some things that we have seen in our experiences, and some areas where we think that you might be able to consider making some changes too. Michelle, any last comments?
Well, just again, thank you for your time this evening, and we wish your council all the best, and Municipality of Brighton all the best as you proceed down the road in terms of looking at your procedural bylaws. So best wishes. Thank you.
Thank you.
And certainly, so sorry, Your Worship, through you, one more comment. Certainly, if there is anything else that we can offer to council, if you think of a question after the fact, and we can maybe provide a little bit more narrative on something that we've spoke about this evening, absolutely don't hesitate to have your clerk reach out to us.
We appreciate that offer as well. Will you be sharing your PowerPoint presentation with the clerk?
Yes.
Yes, we will do that.
Thank you. And Madam Clerk, will you share that with members of council, please? Thank you. Okay. So the motion before me is moved by Councillor Fredis and seconded by Acting Deputy Mayor Rowley that the procedural bylaw training conducted by Michelle Casavecchia-Somers and Michelle Smibert, clerks on call, be received. Is there any discussion? Those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. Thank you both very much.
Good evening, council.
That brings us to citizens' comment. Nobody online, I take it? For the record, we have no one present in the gallery or online to offer citizens' comment this evening. Bringing us to staff reports. Our only report is from, it's not coming up for some reason, but it's from the clerk. So Madam Clerk, do you have anything to add or highlight?
No, I do not.
Motion before me is moved by Councillor Wheeldon, seconded by Councillor Wright. The council received the staff report, municipal bylaw review as information, and that council approved the staff recommendation to schedule a committee of the whole meeting for further review of the procedural bylaw. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Oh, Acting Deputy Mayor Rowley.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
For the review, so my question then is, and maybe this is to the clerk, we all took some notes, you took some notes as well. So will this be coming back then with some revisions for us to do to review before it's approved?
So when we schedule the meeting, we will all sit down and go line by line through this procedural bylaw like we would a strategic plan or the budget. And that's how we'll do it as a council.
Yeah, and I can provide you with what changes I feel that should be in there, and then we can go from there too.
So comments that we have, we will wait until we receive an amended copy from you or revised version.
No, I'm going to bring this back and then I'll just bring a list of things that I think that I would like to have changed.
Right.
And then you can do the same.
Right.
Yes, that's.
And then we'll go
yeah.
through it.
Okay, thank you.
So just for your information, I intend to do like this. Article 1, does anyone want to make any changes to anything in Article 1? And someone will put up their hand and say, yes, well, there's only one item there, but I'd like to make a change. And we'll go through it article by article until 11 o'clock at night rolls around, or until we have to recess, whatever happens first, or until we're finished. And then we'll get through it, just like we do, like I said, through the strategic planning process. Councillor Wielden.
If we're doing it like the budget, does that mean that Acting Deputy Mayor Rowley will be chairing?
That was a hangover from a former procedure bylaw. I've been informed. I'm actually supposed to be in the chair for committee of the whole meetings, and I wasn't aware of that. So I will be sitting right here. You're welcome. Anything further on the motion? All those in favor? There being none opposed, that motion's carried. And we have no one in the gallery or online for question period. We have no in-camera session this evening, and as this is a committee of the whole meeting, I don't have a motion, so it is 7:41 p.m. I declare the committee of the whole meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody.